This podcast is a part of the More Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Leader Podcast by Pattern Talent, where we interview great leaders and we seek to understand leadership. I'm Brad McDonald.
And I'm Taylor Jessup, and we really hope that you enjoy this episode. Part 2, we are kicking off talking again more about your way to peace, your way to better relationships. We started this series talking about courage, conflict, and peace, and how if we really want to have peace in our lives, it's not necessarily going in the backwoods and hanging out where nobody is and avoiding humans, although that's not always bad to avoid humans. I kind of like that myself. But maybe there's
really
something
good.
else. Yeah, it sounds really nice, doesn't it? Maybe there's a way to have peace right where we're at. Maybe there's a way to have better depth of relationships. And our theory from the first podcast that I think you helped prove true, Brad, through kind of our conversation and your framework that we're going to unpack a little bit more right now is, hey, if we can muster up enough courage to enter into conflict, but not just enter into conflict, but do that with tools and a system to help us navigate that. And remember that we're humans, we're prone to certain things, so are the other people. We can actually get through that and maybe have a healthier, richer life. And that conflict can actually bring us closer to people, closer to our goals, closer to where we want to go. So we ended talking about a framework that I'm going to have you introduce. So if you could just real quickly for our listeners, reintroduce that framework, and then we're going to kind of dig in and unpack that and talk all about that today to help guide them through conflict.
I love it, man. Yeah. What we're all chasing in conflict is peace. Like it's a sense of peace, right? And there are usually two ways that we try to go about getting that. One is by asserting ourselves and the desire for our own needs, right? So I assert myself so that I can satisfy my needs, or by cooperating. So I cooperate so that I can try to satisfy other people's concerns, right? And so this kind of dichotomy, this matrix, if you will, of assertiveness kind of on that y-axis and cooperativeness on that x-axis is a great way for us to visualize how conflict works, right? So when I'm unassertive and uncooperative, I'm in that bottom, kind of left corner. I'm avoiding. And we're going to talk about what that means. What does it mean to be conflict avoidant? When I begin to move more into cooperation, but I stay low in assertiveness, I'm accommodating. When I begin to increase some of my assertiveness, I'm compromising, right? Which means I'm asserting myself a little bit and I'm cooperating a little bit, but I'm not doing a lot of either of those things. When I turn up both the assertiveness and the cooperativeness, so I'm highly assertive, I'm very focused on getting what I want, but I'm also highly cooperative and I'm very focused on satisfying your needs, then I'm in a collaborating space. And then finally, when I turn down my cooperativeness, but I remain high in my assertiveness and trying to get my needs met, I'm competing. And what we suggested in our last episode was that there isn't necessarily a good or bad or right or wrong, generally speaking, that all 5 of these styles can be very useful tactics and approaches to having healthy conflict. It really just depends on the circumstances. It depends on the situations at hand. So that's the framework.
Yeah, I love that.
Let it rip, man.
Right. So competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating, right?
Yep.
It sounds to me like when you just described them, I'm just going to put myself in the seat of our listeners, hopefully. I'd be like, man, collaborating sounds like the one that we want to do. You're not necessarily telling us that that's the case, but is that true? Is it, hey, if I was to land on one of those, the one that I want to land on is collaborating, and you say no. Tell me why.
Way.
Tell me why. Because when I hear you talk about it, that's what I would think.
Yeah, that's great. It suggests to us that 2 heads are better than 1, right? And we'll get into this as we get deeper into how we define each one of these and what they feel like within conflict. And it seeks resolution, right, to my concerns as well as yours. It's exploratory, it's a creative style, right? It's all about like, hey, what's the third option? And that's great. But the problem with collaboration is that it's highly impractical. For example, like, do you believe that in every conflict situation, you're going to have a tremendous amount of time and a high level of buy-in from the other party? Because those two things are very much required to have a collaborative solution to a conflict.
Sure.
Furthermore, like just the level of energy that it takes to deal with someone who has a collaborating style. So for example, that'd be me, right? And you can imagine that when you're in a conflict with someone who's collaborating, you might go around the merry-go-round 5 times with a solution before you actually land on something, and that requires a tremendous amount of energy.
Because collaborating, we both need to win. Like you're saying
That's right.
in your particular stance, it's not good enough. If you remember, you talked about this on our last episode. If you and Becca are fighting, it's not good enough just for you to get what you want. You need her to get what she wants or needs, right?
Correct.
And you're not willing to sacrifice that in order, like almost your competition, you're competing is in collaborating, making sure both camps get what they need. So you're saying
That's right.
that's exhausting, or it can be exhausting, right? If in order for this to be okay and the conflict to be resolved, I
Yeah.
need you to be okay just as much as I need what I need. That's interesting.
Absolutely. And if someone else's natural style of conflict is accommodating and they're happy to satisfy your needs, the last thing that they want to do is keep having the conflict and keep like they don't want that. What they want is to meet your need, and that's where they find their satisfaction.
Yeah.
Um, when you force someone into collaboration, it's super taxing. Now, conversely, I would say when someone is super competing and they're dealing with someone who's collaborating, the level of inefficiency that happens in the negotiation process for a collaborating style is way taxing on a competing.
Mm,
Remember, like we're driven, we're super efficient, we're oriented towards, what do I need? How do I get this done as quickly as possible? Those types are very typically like it's a power oriented, it's a defensive position. Like they don't want to negotiate.
mm.
So the
So
process of pulling them into all of that cooperation requires a lot of energy out of
yeah.
someone who's got that natural style.
Interesting. So it seems like there's a couple things. A, you need to know which style you are more prone to, which we talked about a little bit on on the
Right.
episode. And then B, you kind of have to know the context of the problem on which you're going into. So if I'm going into a conflict with somebody that, because we may or may not know what their style is before the conflict happens, right? If you have a client
100%.
and maybe you don't know them super well and this is one of your first conflicts, you don't know that, but you do kind of have to know, well, how much am I willing to compromise? Do I need to avoid this altogether? Do I need to be more accommodating? Like there's a lot of self-awareness, right? So there's kind of the, how
That's
much
right.
do I know about that person? How much do I know about myself? And then what level am I willing to give? So, um, I mean, walk us through a little bit more on how you, like, I'd love to know, Brad's going into a conflict. How do you approach it when you're thinking about this tool and thinking about competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding and accommodating? I may
Yeah,
have said
that's
that twice.
that's a great that's a great question. So first and foremost, I am interested in knowing and understanding what my needs are. What is my goal? What does it mean for me to have a resolution or peace around the conflict?
And do
If
you
I
like write
don't
that out,
have
Brad? Like, do you write that, or how do you know that?
so if it were a negotiation, for example, well, let's use conflict. Let's use not less negotiation because negotiation is a part of conflict. But let's say it's seated in this, like let's say you and I can't agree about something, a business decision we have to make, and it's really important to both of us. It's like right. There's a high level of trust between the two of us, right? There's high level of investment. We can map out a large sum of time together if we need to. That's not problematic for us. We could do it in person, in a private office, right? It wouldn't need to be in public, right? So if I'm mapping out a conflict between you and I, And there's a very, very kind of clear need that I have and clear need that you have, I probably don't need to go through, the exercise of writing that out, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas, let's say it were highly complicated and I didn't know a lot of the variables that would be going on as we were going through this initial discussion, then maybe I would outline some of my concerns and maybe some of the what I would say are like the potential landmines for our conversation.
Okay.
So, or I would even ask questions, for example, that I would need to bring to the conversation. So I might want to try to know like some questions about your personality. Like I might try to find a way to ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself in that
Mm,
process.
yeah.
But one thing I would say too is in addition to wanting to know my needs, what I need to get out of the conversation, I have to have as clear as possible you telling me what you need. So starting a conflict, I might say something like, hey, it's evident that you and I are not on the same page, Taylor. I really have felt like I need this to happen. It seems to me like you really need this to happen. Is that true? Am I right about what your needs are, or have I misunderstood the conversation?
Mm, mm-hmm.
And then I would try to have you inform me as much as possible. And I might have to, put up a spit guard. I might have to put up a little invisible emotional wall between us, depending on your anger level, your frustration, your
Yeah.
depression, whatever it may be. But I have to be able to listen and gather a very clear understanding of what it is you're after. Because if I don't know what you want, then there's no way for us to win.
Yeah. You know what's fascinating about this is this also applies to like marriage. And part of what
Oh
like
yeah.
when I can do what you just talked about, which is figure out what I need and at least figure out the story that I'm writing about what the other person needs, because it's a story. It's not necessarily fact. It's what I'm saying. The chances that that conflict between me and Janelle goes better is exponentially so. Like I'll feel myself get mad and be like when I'm in a good place. This is not all the time. And if I can go get some space, and I did this a while back, I called you and I needed to talk through. I'm like, hey, am I crazy? What's going on? Okay, so what's the story that I'm telling myself about what I'm perceiving? Then what's the story that I think that she's telling myself? And if I can figure out what I actually need in that, like, hey, I'm not feeling my needs getting met here, and my story that I'm telling myself is that you feel like you're not getting your needs met here. That changed the whole dynamics. Like that changed
Totally.
everything. The challenge or a challenge for me is when emotions get involved
Mhm.
or when oftentimes we start the conflict, we don't know what we want, right? Business, sometimes there's more space. Personal life, there's not always that space, right? Business,
Totally.
you may have a meeting coming up and it's 2 weeks away, or maybe it's tomorrow. Sometimes it's in the heat of the moment, and you do have to do it. But I found that super interesting. It was well articulated by you that like, hey, if I can figure out what my needs are and your needs are, and clearly articulate that, you have fought a good chunk of the battle, right? Then you can use the rest of this tool to really inform that. So okay, there's a lot of
Mhm.
monologuing by me.
No, it's
This is
great.
where
It's a great
this is where
insight. I totally agree.
this is where have you ever seen oh my gosh, The Incredibles?
Yes, it's been a long
Yeah.
time though.
There's a line where he says, "You sly dog, you got me monologuing." So I'm blaming that on you, Brad. You got me monologuing. But
You're
okay, so
welcome.
go back to it. So you're using it. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to figure out what your needs are and what you perceive their needs are. And then what's the next part you would think? Oh, and you said you might try and figure out and do some research on, you know, covert research on, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself to understand them. What else are you going to do? How else do you apply this tool to your conflicts?
Yeah, that's good. I I want to know. I want to be very clear on the styles that are available to me, right? So I'll give you just a quick rundown on like a quick high level rundown on what the styles kind of represent, and then what I want to do is I want to remember that there are some key situational attributes. I
Mm,
want to do a quick analysis, right, on what's happening here and of my of the five options on my menu, which do I think is actually going to be most successful at getting my needs and their needs met
Hmm.
based on the situational attributes, right? So real quick, compete, right? We talked about this one a little bit. It's highly assertive. It's uncooperative. And it's kind of this, the sort of caricature of this would be like might makes right. So I'm dealing with my own concerns. It's a power-oriented and defensive position, right? I'm trying to get what I want. And remember, we have to reframe this. We're not saying that that's bad necessarily. It just depends on the situation. There are certain situations where a competing style of conflict it's horrific and it totally kills relationships. But there are certain situations where a competing style of conflict is necessary and healthy, and it's exactly what needs to happen. For example, if I'm in a conflict and it's with a person who's narcissistic or maybe manipulative, maybe they're using things like gaslighting to try to persuade me to do something that I have no desire or maybe is immoral or unethical, right? We're going to want to be very like power oriented. We're going to want to say, no, I'm not doing something. Like you don't have the right to ask me to or force me to, right? You're tracking, right?
Yeah. I'm tracking.
I'm making sense. So that's competing. Accommodating, opposite, right? Unassertive, uncooperative. And it's kind of this idea from a caricature of kill your enemies with kindness, right? And it can be neglectful in its unhealthy forms, right? It can have healthy self-sacrifice. It can be very generous. It can be charitable. It can also be like obeying or yielding. You can be a little bit of a noodle or like a marshmallow. It can be a little too soft sometimes in an accommodating way of being. But it can also just be just an extremely warm-hearted, kind way to approach
Right.
finding peace
Yeah.
with people. Compromising, right? More moderate in its approach, combining some of the competing and accommodating tactics. It kind of is a split the difference idea, right? From a caricature standpoint. And there's a book, Never Split the Difference. There's a lot of thought about that. But honestly, I think that we spend most of our time in compromise. I think in general, most of our time is spent in this kind of expedient. It's like, let's be equally sad, right? We're both partially satisfied. We're mutually unhappy. There's all kinds of, phrases I use here with
Sure.
clients,
Yeah.
but because we feel so shitty in conflict and it's so stressful and irritating to be in conflict with one another, we try to get out of it as fast as possible. And so that's why compromising tends to be, again, it's highly expedient and it just tends to be the easiest place for us to land.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's interesting as you talk about each of them individually. I kind of cringe, which is
Yeah.
that's
part of the idea, right?
Yeah. And
why is that?
Well, I think the connotation that we have, in the tool. So when you say collaborating, I mean, the first thing that went to my head was actually positive until you started to describe it in excess. And then I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Maybe that's not good. Competing, I just kind of have this connotation of steamrolling. Like, hey, if I'm going to compete, I'm going to steamroll you. Compromising, which is in the middle, is kind of the same. And it was interesting when I got this like almost visceral response when you're like, yeah, we just want to get out of conflict as fast as possible. I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I think avoiding and accommodating are a little bit easier. It's like, well, if I'm avoiding something, that's exactly what we're saying not to do, right? In terms of conflict in general. And yet there are times when we need to avoid, and accommodating is like, if I'm just doing whatever the heck you want. So interesting.
You're raising a really good point, Taylor, because I think that, yes, taken to excess, they all get pretty icky pretty quick.
Yeah.
Right. But like, for example, part of avoid is just recognizing when a conflict arises and it's just not a priority to me.
Right.
Like live in, the caricature there is live and let live. Like You do you. Like, what's your truth, right? It's diplomatic. It's very, what I would call just with a little bit withdrawn at times. It's like, hey, you know what, man? If that's what you need, that's what you need. No skin off my back. Like, this isn't even an issue.
Yeah.
So there are ways where avoiding, um, it can be equally expedient, right? But when you're avoiding, again, this is where it gets unhealthy and why we don't like it. When you're avoiding based on fear of the other person, that can be very unsustainable and very unhealthy,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Most things in life and taken to excess are not going to be good for you, right? So competing is fine, but competing to excess is steamrolling. Avoiding actually can be fine, but avoiding in excess is just hiding in the corner and being scared, right? Accommodating can be
Right.
totally fine, but accommodating to, that extent is just, I'm just going to roll over and maybe it's codependent and, all those kind of things. So it is interesting because you're doing kind of like an assessment of, okay, who am I? Who is this person? What's the situation? And then what does the situation require of me to navigate this conflict well?
Yeah. Well summarized. That's great.
That's kind of a maybe we call that a roadmap to peace in your conflict, which here's the deal. Usually conflict comes, usually peace comes as a result of the storm and not the other way around, right?
Correct.
Like, I think oftentimes I would be the one that would be prone to, like, if I just avoid this for long enough, I'll be okay. But I think it was Chad Brown that was like, hey, that the dragon that you don't face today will defeat you tomorrow, you know?
Right. Yep.
Which was a
Yeah.
great word of
So
like,
good.
okay, so instead of avoiding it, maybe we press into it and we use this tool, right? Try and go assess kind of what's going on with you. What are you prone to? What do you need or want out of the situation? What's the story that you think that the other person wants out of the situation? And then what does the
Mhm.
situation require of you? Which some of that seems like some situational awareness too, right? Of just
That's right.
emotional intelligence, understanding the other person, asking the right questions, and getting the reps.
Yeah.
Um,
So let's do a quick grid, right, on how you can discern which conflict style that you want to use. So for example, one question I would just ask is like, how stressed out are we? So if you and I are in a conflict and we're both, let's say we're both experiencing, high levels of acute stress response and we're ready to like fight one another, right? This is where we're in potential danger zone of like not being able to actually communicate with one another, right? Where like I actually fundamentally stop listening, right? And I can only like react out of frustration and anger. So stress, I think, is a huge factor. Yeah, you're used to me fighting that way. Um, The next question would be, how much trust do I have with this person? If I have a sense of a high level of trust, well, then that opens up the doors to a variety of styles that I like. For example, if we have a very low level of trust, sometimes you know we're going to stick to the edges, right? We're going to compete, avoid, and accommodate. We're not going to start really compromising and collaborating if we don't have trust. Um, yeah, one question was like would just be, how effective are we communicating? Like if I feel like we're making good progress and our interaction is effective, then I want to actually increase both assertiveness and cooperativeness. I want to see us moving more to a compromising and collaborating style because
yeah.
it's working. Like we're getting closer to both having a sense of satisfaction. Um, the level of priority, when something's really important to both of us, then we can invest more time, we can invest
Mm.
more energy, right? We can invest more trust. We're okay with the level of stress that we're experiencing because it's important and it matters. If it doesn't matter, by all means avoid and accommodate. Move on with your life, right?
Don't get hung up.
Right. Sometimes the complexity of an issue, like is it a simple or is it a complex issue? If it's simple, then and it's super black and white and the needs are very clear, Like that's an important factor in how much time and energy we're going to invest in compromising and collaborating, right? Because those become these emotionally expensive ways of handling conflict.
Mm,
They're highly verbose, they require a bunch of time, etc.
yeah.
And then and then lastly, just, a blanket idea of like the time question. Like, if we're trying to resolve something really quickly before a meeting that we have, if we're trying to resolve something really quickly before we have to make and communicate a decision, again, we're going to really try to quickly weigh how important is this relative to the time that we have together.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my grid, right?
That's good.
Um, we can get more if you're interested into like some of the dimensions of conflict and um, or what I would call like the zones of conflict. Um, that's an interesting take on it if you want to go deeper. But I'm curious, like, I don't know, what insights, what questions do you have? I've talked about the framework a lot, but I'm curious how
Yeah.
you've seen this in business and maybe with clients as well.
No, that's good, man. I think asking or at least being able to tell how stressed out somebody is very helpful. Like, I think all of those are very insightful for which style you need to use. For what part of the framework do we have? But hey, do we even have enough time? Because
Right.
if we don't have enough time, there's no reason that we just got to get a solution, right? And
So
we've
a
had,
perfect example of this, right, is have you and Janelle ever been in an argument on the way to church on Sunday morning?
uh, yeah, on the way to
Right.
anywhere, we can get in an argument on the way, on a walk around the block. So, but yes, church, yeah, all the
On the
things.
way to date night, on the way to
Sure.
dinner,
Oh,
right?
those are
If
the
you have a
best. Yeah,
reservation,
those are the best. Yeah.
right? So those are great examples of like, with our spouses, opportunities where we just really need to gauge, is this the appropriate time to have the conflict, or is this the appropriate time to say, hey, I totally understand where you're coming from. I think we're probably going to need to sit down over a coffee and talk this out, like get a babysitter and just be one-on-one for a little while. Let's not worry about it right now.
Sure.
Let's worry about it later. Like I'm totally game to have the conversation, but you know, that's a great instance of avoiding something, not because you never intend to resolve it, but because you recognize now is not the time to handle something.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that space can actually be really helpful because you may be thinking, God, this is going to take forever. And you get a little space from it. The stress is high. Stress comes down. You go, huh, it's not as big of a deal. Or, you know what? I'm more willing to compromise or collaborate or, accommodate once I've got that space. But understanding the time frame first, actually, I do think that is pretty important. So, complexity of the problem, like you just give a lot of good questions. Like I feel like if our listeners were able to go into a conflict, and we're not always this self-aware in our conflicts because emotions get involved and then we throw a lot of these tools right out the door. But if we can go into those conflicts asking ourselves those questions, plus what do I want, what do they want, and what am I prone to, what are they prone to, man, we might be surprised by how effective and maybe even how connected we might be afterwards. you know
Oh, totally.
um it was
Yeah,
Shane Kuiper that was like, hey, conflict, he said conflict used to think for me it was the end of relationships, but he saw conflict actually as a means to deeper relationships. Like just
totally.
flip that around, man.
That's right.
um and I've seen
I'll
that in the workplace.
I'll add three categories right on top of these five styles. And this will help, I think, frame our conflict in an interesting and novel way that people won't have heard before. So, for example, when I'm approaching a conflict, I can ask myself this question, right? Do I want to distribute needs? Like we both have needs. What do we want to do with the needs? Do we want to distribute them to one another? Do we want to integrate our needs together? Or do we need to protect our own individual needs?
Hmm.
Right? So protect, integrate, distribute.
Yeah.
And it's really important to remember to go, and I'm like said this like 8 times, so it's probably super annoying to the listener at this point. We're not saying that one is better than the other. We're
Right.
saying that when you're dealing with the needs of two conflicting situations, two conflicting people, you can distribute them, right? So think compete and accommodate, right? You get your needs, I get my needs. How much do I need? How much do you need? When do you need it? When do I need it? We're distributing those needs to each party.
Mm.
Very much like, compromise that can kind of cut, across compromising too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Integrative, right, is kind of this compromising and collaborating style. It's about what we both get. Like, how do we frame it in terms of like, man, we can actually both get more of what we want if like the stars align and we can actually come up with a collaborative, and it's very rare, obviously,
Yeah,
but
sure.
um, that's about us integrating our needs and seeing them from a whole standpoint rather than two separate things.
Yeah.
And then with protect, look, there are just times in life where two people see things differently and they both need to protect what they already have
Mm.
and just keep what they already possess. That it's not about how do we get more. It's not about getting something. It's about keeping what I've already acquired and not losing something.
Right.
So think in that scenario of like a business is closing down and we are trying to make sure like profitability, let's say profitability is not, in the forecast here, right? We're trying to just make sure that we don't incur uh, losses that hurt us beyond what we can recover from. Okay.
Mm.
That's a great example in business negotiation where we're like, hey, let's protect investment. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, protect investment, maybe protect team. If you're having a conversation where you're just like, hey, I gotta protect my team here on this one. Like I'm not willing
Mhm.
to engage in that. That's good, man. It is an interesting thought because you're right. A lot of those things taken out of context sound negative, but they're not. They just are the way that they are. Sometimes it's okay to be protective. Other times we need to be more integrative. Like it just depends, right? Sometimes we got to distribute. We really a lot of situational awareness there. So,
That's
Brad,
right.
as we're kind of landing this plane, I mean, what are your key takeaways? Because I'm not always going to probably well, let me say it this way. We have a lot of tools, and I think everybody has a lot of tools in life, and tools are great, but the best tool is one that you actually use.
Mhm.
So, how would you remind our listeners or help them to go? Here's the I don't know the version of this that I would never go into a conflict without. Like here's the things that I would not that I would do, like whether that's, hey, I need to pause for 3 minutes, just remember X, Y, and Z, remember what's my needs, their needs. Like what are your biggest things that you make sure that you do before every conflict if you
Yeah.
are maybe not 100% integrated with the dimensions and the five and all those things? What would you do?
Yeah. Yeah, what's the quick and dirty version of how to execute this today, right?
Yeah.
So a couple thoughts. One is recognize, this goes back to a conversation we had with Nikki a couple weeks ago, which was recognize that in addition to downside risk, there's upside risk too. The
Mm,
way that like our friends from Take New Ground would say this, Adrian, Dan, and Chad, is they would just ask the question, what's possible?
mm,
Like when I look at this conflict, can I remove myself from whatever anger, frustration, or fear, uncertainty that might be causing me anxiety? Can I say, what's possible with this person? Now, the answer to that question may be grim, but at least we've taken a second to ask what's possible. Okay. And that's very different than jumping to the next question, which is, what are my needs? What are their needs? So
right.
remember that there's upside risk. Ask what's possible here and get an idea of what some of the potential is. This a doorway to something bigger and better than what I can currently see?
Mm,
Recognize that you have your needs, they have their needs. We're looking for clarity there. And then remember that, look, there's a field of options as it results, or as it relates to how much I accommodate them, and how much I compete to keep what I need.
mm,
And And I think that's a big part of it. A lot of it for me, though, Taylor, is just being aware of my emotions and recognizing, like my wife did this the other day. She said, "Hey, I don't think that we're going to continue to have a productive conversation if we keep talking about this right now. Like, let's reset. Let's reset." And it was super. And she was totally right, because I was getting heated and she was getting heated, and she just caught us in the middle of like an escalating dialogue. It was moving beyond healthy debate and conversation. And it was like, it was beginning to get frustrated and angry and a little bit resentful toward one another. And so her ability to stop that cycle and enter in a breath and a beat there enabled us to actually, we didn't have a great conclusion to that dialogue, but we took really good care of each other as we hashed out
That's good.
something that looked a lot more like a compromise than both of us trying to compete.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And
great.
yeah, and so that's what I would give. I'm curious. I want to ask you a question here as we conclude, which is, why am I what am I afraid of losing with conflict? Like, when I look at conflict and I so often see the downside risk. And I'm curious how you would answer this question, which is, what am I afraid of losing as I engage in a conflict?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit subjective to the person, but I'll tell you most of my experiences, and most of the people that I've talked to would be afraid, like fear of loss of relationship, a lot of times, and sometimes it doesn't feel like that, and or fear of loss of X, the money, the opportunity, the, whatever it is. I think that our brains are so wired to see a situation as to, how do I protect myself from this? And this person or this problem may be able to harm me. And so I think rather than gravitating towards how does it bring us closer together, I typically think it goes to, well, geez, what's the worst case scenario, and how would that harm me as a person and in my relationships? Like, we all want to be seen, known, loved, not rejected, and there's a giant fear of like rejection, right? And we can assign that to the given conflict rather than understanding. So like, I mean, same way. I mean, I had to work through for a number of years. My tendency when I got to where you and Becca were the other night is to want to fight through, because I used to be so afraid of that loss that like that was going to be the end of the relationship. And so I would say that that's the biggest one, man. Fear of loss of, and typically like relationship or something that I super value. So, and I would agree. Look, the higher the emotion, the more we need to take a break.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think this framework can be a helpful solution to dealing with that fear, right? We say this all the time: the obstacle is the way, right? The way to is the way through, right? So how do we remember these things as we step into conflict, knowing that on the other side of a healthy conflict is the peace that we all want?
Yeah.
It's not fear, but it's confidence, right? Let's go back to the beginning of episode 1. Once we have that confidence, we can oftentimes remember it and muster up the courage to advance into more of the same things, knowing, hey, I've been successful at this before. Hey, I've got a great framework that is setting me up to be really effective.
Yeah.
And I think that I found more and more that I practice this framework, I see that taking place in my own life and the lives of my clients.
100%. 100%. I think it is a great framework that you've given us, Brad. Super grateful for that. And I hope that our listeners can take that, use it, apply it, ask questions, comment in the chats, do all those things, guys. Like, subscribe, come on back next time. Brad, any last words for our listeners?
We love you guys. Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed these last couple episodes where it's just been Taylor and I really getting into some tools and tactics that have been valuable to us. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode.